I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. My friend Naomi Chase's observations and never-ending curiosity make her poetry so appealing. She's a political feminist who writes about our lives with humor and wit, and she's my guest today. Hello.
Hello, Ronnie.
So what's a poet, or what's poem? What is a poetry? What's a poem?
Archibald MacLeish says a poem should not mean but be. People are often say, what does it mean? What does this poem mean? When they should just read it and see how it affects them.
That's good and comforting, because sometimes it's daunting to read a poem and have to analyze it. It's kind of a thing,
well,
right?
It's very daunting. For instance, I don't think there are very many people that could, quote, understand Emily Dickinson.
Right.
But if you read her, you understand it in your heart. And you really know what she's talking about. It's not a literal one-for-one translation.
So it's an impression and an image and a mood?
Well, part of it, a lot of it is the image. I mean, poetry works by images, going from one to another and hopefully developing them.
So when you write poetry, do you write it after conjuring an image?
No, I usually start with a line that appeals to me and then move from that. When I started to write this book, Gittel, which is, I call it Gittel, the Would-Be Messiah, I was driving along one day and I was really thinking about the Messiah, whom I think I'm obsessed with in some way, because what is the Messiah? He's such been held out for generations to be our hope and our savior. And I imagined this young woman in Poland talking to God, and he's so impressed with her that he makes her the Messiah. And, you know, I can't tell you where that came from.
Was that a dream?
No, it wasn't a dream.
Yeah.
It was maybe a waking dream.
Yeah. Were you always interested in poetry?
Yes. Yes, I think I wrote my first poem when I was like 6 years old. I wrote it about a neighbor's dog, of course.
And did you know you were writing a poem?
Yes.
And how did that happen?
I don't know. I started writing, as I said, at that age, and then when I was 10, I wrote a poem about being young and living forever, and it was published in 17. Okay. And I guess I always knew that I was a poet and a writer, but I was really afraid of going too far into myself, which I think you have to do, especially in poetry. Because as I got older, I knew of so many woman writers who went crazy, like Virginia Woolf. And of course, I don't think she went crazy because she was a writer. But you have to go, as I said, into yourself, and sometimes that's dangerous.
I've always said you were my most intellectual friend, because I think you are. I mean, you have. But do you have to be an intellectual to write poetry?
No, I don't.
I mean, what's an intellectual? I don't even know what that is.
I don't think you have to be, but I think you have to be interested and have some knowledge of the world, and also have a feeling for people. I mean, I think George Eliot is a great novelist, and she's probably the most intelligent of many novelists that I know, and it shows. When you're reading someone, you know if there's a mind in there.
So you grew up in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And you have a sister, one sibling?
I have one sibling.
Mother and father?
Mother and father.
Both born in this country?
No, my father was born in Vienna, and my mother was born in Poland.
And your father was an attorney?
My father was an attorney, and then he was a United States congressman. And then he was a judge in the local common pleas court in Pennsylvania.
So that's why you wrote The Judge's Daughter?
Yes.
Which is one of your poems, right?
Right.
And were you interested in sports and friends, and were you popular in school?
About sports, no, I wasn't interested in sports, except at one point when I was supposed to be taking a Hebrew lesson, I went to an audition for a cheerleader. And my mother confronted me about that in the bathtub. Was I popular? I don't know. I remember my mother saying, she must be popular. She's the editor of her yearbook. And I thought, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm not popular?
So you've always been interested in looking at things and
Yes.
studying things and analyzing things.
Right. Well, of course, I come from a political family.
Right.
So.
And a family that seemed to be religious.
No, they weren't
No.
religious. They were, and they weren't even observant. I mean, my grandfather, who in those days you would call conservative, which today is Orthodox, taught Hebrew at a synagogue, and I think he was a communist. He was not religious, and I loved to go to the synagogue with him because I loved to be with him. He was full of life. But I was not religious, and when I started to write this book, I read a lot about Jewish life and literature, and I was obsessed in a way with what does it mean to be Jewish.
So have you ever answered that question?
Well, for me, it means to be part of the tradition. I'm not very observant. I don't go to synagogue. I don't keep kosher. I get kind of impatient with those habits. But if people want to, obey tradition, that's fine with me, as long as it's not fundamentalist.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. What do you think about the fundamentalists?
I think they're dangerous, all of them, whether they're Jewish or whether they're Muslim or whether they're Christian. I don't think they really have human values. They're didactic and they're ideological, and I think that's not a good thing. I think religion has done a lot of damage.
So other than Gittel, have you written about it?
Well, the title poem of one of my books, which is Waiting for the Messiah in Somerville, Mass., I started to write that after my husband died. And it really took me about 10 years to write that poem because I couldn't find the right thing to say. And the idea of waiting for the Messiah was that I was, and the people around me were all waiting to be saved or transformed. And so you try to believe in something that will save you, but I don't think anything can save you but yourself.
But so growing up in a political family, I mean, that's also an important part of your life.
Absolutely. I tend to see everything as political. I mean, I've written two what you would call nonfiction books, one on the 70s and one on child abuse, and those were certainly political. And then I stopped writing, and I was a reporter for the Village Voice,
yeah,
but I stopped writing about that because it was so depressing and because I didn't see anything changing. And I started to write fiction, and then I went back to poetry. And I'd much rather do that.
What do you call your kind of poetry? Because it's basically, it's a story. It's a long story.
Yes. Well, I would call this is clearly narrative, but I think my poetry is really lyrical, even when it's telling a story. That is, I think it focuses on the words, the images, and the feelings. Narrative poetry, usually it tells a story, sometimes it doesn't do anything else. Although narrative poetry is not very popular nowadays.
What's lyrical poetry?
Lyrical poetry pays attention to the emotion, and Shakespeare's sonnets are lyrical. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You would never mistake that for a narrative. Mm-hmm. I can't think of anything at the minute, of course, but that's what the difference is.
So why is poetry not more important in our lives? You think? Have you figured that out?
Well, to some extent. I think partly because we're so badly taught. At one point, I taught poetry at the Salvation Army on Cape Cod, and I had a lot of people in the class who would say to me, I would bring in poems by contemporary poets and others, and they'd say, oh, that's what poetry is. I never thought it was like that. And, their idea of poetry, because they had been taught this, was, I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree.
Or the poem, what do you call that when they had a formula for when it rhymed or the sentences and that kind of thing?
Well, there were standard forms, and that's almost like a limerick. But I found that after a while, they could really write poetry because they could get into it. And I'll give you another example. I taught a continuing education class at Harvard at one point, and I was sitting waiting for the students to come in, and this very large guy carrying a bag, 2 bags full of newspapers walk in, and I say, oh my God, I hope he's not in my class. And of course he was. And the first line of the first poem that he wrote was, "The stag at eve hath drunk her fill." And I said to him, where did you ever see a stag at eve? And he said, well, that's the kind of poems you're supposed to write. And I said, no, you're supposed to write about your own feelings and experiences. And he did. It was quite amazing to see the shift.
Why did he keep all the newspapers in bags?
I never found out.
You're teaching now in a public school.
Yes.
And what's that like?
Well, it's fun. And it's wonderful to be exposed to, I'm teaching 4th and 5th grade, to be exposed to the enthusiasm. The children that I'm teaching are PS 51 in Hell's Kitchen, and I think they don't have a large world to draw from. Many of them are children who are not read to at home. Although it's surprising, when I ask them to bring in poems, I would say about 1/3 of them can find a poem somewhere, even though they say, I don't know any poems. They're very curious and they're very enthusiastic. And when you say to them, poetry is about expressing your own feelings, you can write about what you feel. And a hand will go up and say, can I write about something I want to do? Or can I write about something I never did? Or, of course I say, yes, write about something you never did. Write about something silly. Write about something crazy. It's to open up people's minds, and they're great.
So have any of our prominent people been known for their love of poetry? Is that a crazy question to ask?
Well,
I mean, why does every president have a poet at an inaugural ceremony?
Because they think they should, I think is the reason. I don't know if anybody did before Kennedy. Kennedy had Robert Frost. And I guess most people who read poetry, if they read it seriously, read Robert Frost. He is a great American poet. Now, I don't know if Kennedy read much poetry. We know that Robert Kennedy did. He was always quoting Aeschylus.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people. Carolyn Kennedy has a book of her favorite poems for children, which is quite an interesting book. And I would say that her mother read to her, obviously. I can't answer that question about political people. I don't know whether Obama reads poetry or not.
Yeah. Let's hope he does, I guess.
Let's hope he does.
Because obviously it's a very extension of one's...
He did put money in the budget for the arts, and though a lot of people complained about it as though, ugh, art, what does that have to do with life? It has a lot to do with life.
Yeah. Is writing poetry like psychoanalysis?
I wrote a book called The Judge's Daughter, which was about my family. And when a friend of mine read it, he said, you accomplished something in this book that you couldn't have accomplished in therapy. And I think I did that instead of therapy. I was trying to figure out my relationship to my parents. And of course, everybody tries to figure out their relationship to their parents. But I think art is a very transformative occupation. And I think very often in art, painters and writers, musicians, it may not be so easy to hear in music, but basically you're always writing about yourself.
It's very interesting. So you believe that the humanities, studying humanities or whatever falls within that category.
Well, I think that in times of trouble especially, that the arts are very important. It's not that they're a distraction, but they remind you of things and emotions that are really important in life. And we all need that, whether it's in bad times or good.
So do you want to read a little bit for us? You want to tell us about Gittel?
Well, Gittel is was a young girl who was born in a shtetl in Poland. And although the book passes through time, I would say, and here's the first poem in the book. This is how she's hooked by God. How a voice looks. Gittel hears it just before sleep. The doll who cries, "Mama," the one with braids like hers is gone. Gittel kneels, peers under the bed, rolls onto her back to see how a voice looks. The voice asks, "What did you see?" She says, "Dust from mother's broom, a lace from father's boots, my cat's belled collar." "What else?" the voice asks. "Use the eyes I gave you." And then Gittel goes on to tell him what she sees, and the voice says, "Better." And she asks him who he is, and he says, "I'm the thumb your doll sucks, your cat's bell, I'm the itch between your thighs." And she says, "And I'm a fool to listen while a devil speaks of thighs." "I like your impudence," the voice says. "You were mine, still to be written." And she says, "Who wants a fool to serve them?" And he says, "I am what I am," which is what God says in the Bible when, I think it's Moses, when he gets the Ten Commandments, asks him who he is, and he says, "I am what I am." So Gittel goes on having these conversations with God, and she distrusts them. She wants to make him prove who he is. And she carries on a series of arguments with God about the way the world is and why he hasn't done anything about it. And at some point in the book, he tells her that she's to be the Messiah. And she's very troubled by that because she doesn't feel like a Messiah-like person. In her travels, she goes to America and grows up. She leaves her boyfriend in Poland, and at one point she gets pregnant. And her last conversations with God, which have to do with the kind of life she's going to lead afterwards, she accuses him. She says, "I'm not going to be the Messiah because I don't like what you've done with the world. You have given man dominion over women and over all creatures, and dominion is one of the big sins in the universe." And then she says to him, "You should really start over."
So
that's her turn down, right?
So what does that mean?
I think that means that we can't accept myths without questioning them. We can't accept either political myths or religious myths without questioning them. And I think it also means that they have to relate to our own life. And of course, Gittel is a feminist, and she doesn't like the idea of men having domain over women or over anyone else, because isn't that what all our wars are about? I'm going to be the ruler here. I'm going to be the occupier.
So what do you think about the world today and what the politics and everything are?
I think it's sad and scary. I think that of course, that we have done terrible things in the name of freedom and democracy. And America has always been an expansionist country, but at least we just did it on our own continent. And Americans started out with dominating the Indians. And now they're trying to dominate the Iraqis, and now we're in Afghanistan. I think about Afghanistan, people are always saying, the Persians never conquered it. That was thousands of years ago. Nobody has ever conquered it. And why should we want to? Why can't we just care about taking care of ourselves and our own lives?
Well, because we're supposedly worried about terrorists. Is that a myth? Not really.
No, it's not a myth, but I think we have to be really careful how we define it. After all, the first thing that Bush did was to bomb Iraq when it wasn't the Iraqis who were the terrorists.
Right.
So they can't be an excuse for either invading a country or taking away our civil liberties. And terrorism is, you can't fight terrorism. I mean, I think that
directly head
on, right? You can certainly put in safeguards, and
you can try also to bring more equity in the world so that people aren't susceptible to
Right.
trying to ruin it or blow it up.
Right.
Do you think, but you talk about myths and Gittel's questioning the myths. There are total parallels, aren't there, in our political lives? I mean, people believed the myth that Iraq had,
Had nuclear weapons.
Right.
Yes, you could call that a myth.
right. They believed the myth that we were supposed to spread, that we were going to spread democracy. I mean, it's a whole kind of thing. So it relates directly to our lives, and that we should question things, right? That's what Gittel did.
Absolutely. And I mean, spreading democracy, as I said, America has always been an expansionist country. I mean, look, we started with 13 colonies and we ended up, across the Pacific. We took Texas from Mexico. We bought Louisiana. And we were pretty terrible to the people who were here before we were. We took their land. And when in one important Supreme Court case, the Cherokees went to the Supreme Court that their land was being taken, and the Supreme Court decided for them. And Andrew Jackson said, "I don't care, the Supreme Court doesn't have any troops."
Oh, very good. So
That's typical of the American attitude. They don't have any troops, so we'll just go take over.
and then it's also the exercise of power.
It's the exercise of power, and it's the sureness that we're right. I mean, I don't think any of us like people who think they're always right, that you can't talk with, that you can't reason with. And I think it's very dangerous to think, as I said before, about fundamentalists, that the way they see the world is the right way, because there isn't any right way.
So is poetry always questioning?
I think it should be. I mean, there are many kinds of poetry, and it's interesting. I was just going to say, I don't think Shakespeare wrote political poetry, but that isn't true.
Right.
All of his plays are political. They're about the abuse of power. His sonnets are about something else. And I think the great Greek writers wrote about power and about myths, the Greek myths, and the myths of conquest and revenge. So I think that, yes, I think politics is very important.
What do we call this form of poetry where you
Where it's a narrative, you mean, and a lyric?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
I call it a novel in verse.
You do title each page.
I do
and
title
with the verse.
each page, and as a matter of fact, each poem can be read individually, even though it's part of a story.
Right. So is there something you call that kind of a poem, or is that just?
No, it's a novel in verse, really.
So would a book like this ever be on the bestseller list?
I doubt it. I don't
And
think.
if it was, how would it be classified? It would have to be under fiction.
Maybe. I mean, Derek Walcott, who got the Nobel Prize for Poetry, wrote a novel in verse that was a retelling of the Odyssey. He may have sold a lot of books, but he was never on the best-selling list. I don't think that any poet, I mean, the problem with a poet is making a living.
Yeah.
You cannot make a living as a poet because one poem that I wrote about Francis of Assisi, I said to my accountant, "Can I deduct my trip to Italy?" And he said, "What did you get paid for the poem?" And I said, $30. And he said, "That's what you can deduct." So, and poets don't get paid unless they teach. What they call it the Poe business. And most of the poets that I know are teaching in universities because they have to survive.
So it's very much like being a painter or an artist.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's hard to have your poetry published?
It's very hard to have your poetry published, and it's harder than ever. And some people say that's because there are so many more poets. Although Bill Knott, who was a very interesting poet, said there are never too many poets, there are too many submarine commanders. But the big presses, the big publishing houses publish very little poetry. And the university presses and people who start their own presses have had to do that. I started my own press for a while with 2 other women because we couldn't get our books published. And it was an enormous amount of work.
And then how do you sell them? Can you place them in bookstores?
You have to give readings. The publisher of this book, of Gittel, and of my next book, makes it very clear that, you know, they'll send out 15 review copies and the rest is up to you. So what you do is you sit down and you get the list of all the public libraries in New York and you call them up and try to get a reading there. Or the Y, or some restaurants like the Cornelia Street Cafe, where I'm reading in a couple weeks. They have always had poetry readings and artists there.
What's the title of the new book?
Anonymous Fox. And that's a political poem.
And then it's F-O-X.
F-O-X, right.
And
right.
How does it relate?
Well, that poem started with an image I saw, the remains of a fox outside my studio.
So.
And a friend of mine who is a painter said, I want to make a paintbrush of its tail. And I was horrified.
And so that's where we went.
Right.
So we've come to the end of this interview. Thank you. It was wonderful. I hope people will pay more attention to poetry and try. I mean, maybe a lot of people do, but it doesn't seem to be a mainstream.
It's definitely not mainstream.
Yeah. And it can bring so much pleasure.
It can.
Yeah.
I think it is a great source of pleasure.
Right. Thanks, Naomi Chase.
Thank you.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.